Thank you very much for being here today. Before we start our activity or our workshop today, as non-Indigenous Australian but with some Indigenous heritage from South America, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Also, I want to pay respect to the elders past and present, and to Aboriginal people present today, as well as non-Aboriginal people from different cultural and diverse cultural heritages. And I want to highlight that it's important for the Faculty of Science to acknowledge this, because Indigenous people not only are the first Australians, but also they have generated a lot of knowledge about nature in the last 65,000 years, or possibly more, that they have been here in Australia. And knowledge in different areas, not only about animals, not only about the environment, but about the natural world. And it's where we can see the opportunity for the Faculty of Science, a diverse Faculty of Science that also includes history and psychology, that we can have the opportunity to be able to understand more about that and celebrate and build bridges with natural sciences. So, welcome today, and this workshop was mainly generated for various reasons. One is how we can encourage academic staff to embed one of the graduate qualities of the university, that is about cultural competence. But how we can share experiences from the science perspective about embedding cultural competence. We are going to have a number of speakers from the DVC Education, the Associated in Education, and also from the SOLS and from the School of Veterinary Science. And then we are going to have a workshop. This workshop, we hope, is very interactive, and we can contribute. We know that all of us, we are learning in this space. So please don't assume that I know all of things, or Gabrielle, or the people who John knows everything about cultural competence. We are also in that process of learning. We can make mistakes, but the important thing is how we can learn together to overcome those mistakes sometimes. Without much introduction, I would like to introduce Dr. Gabrielle Russell-Mundine, who is going, Russell-Mundine, yes, it's the group, yeah, who has a large work or large experience in cultural competence, has been very successful in grants related to cultural competence. And today she's going to share with us about what is the meaning of cultural competence. But before we continue, yes? Okay.
So she's probably to the lots.
The lots, yeah.
But before we can continue, please, I encourage you just to write your name here and just stick that so we know to you, and so we know who we are talking, because we are not familiar with all people here. So, to start with, just my name is Jaime Góngora. Thank you very much.
As Jaime said, I don't know any of you really. So can we just do a quick whip around who you are and where you're from, so everybody gets to know. Start with you, John.
I'm John Harley from the DVC Education portfolio, working in the Education Innovation.
John O'Byrne from Physics, also Associate Dean Student Life.
Mike Wheatland, Associate in Education and Physics.
Tom Jeffcott, Education Design Team from the Faculty of Science.
Hello, Vasilis Katsaris from the School of Geosciences.
Fiona Del-Sandra from School of Chemistry.
Toby Hudson from Chemistry and the DL program.
I'm Chris McElhenney, also from the School of Chemistry and the Third Musketeer.
Liam Johnson from Psychology, Curriculum Development and Psychology.
Gareth from Souls.
I'm Brooke Story-Lewis, I'm from Pharmacology and Design.
I'm Kate, I'm from the School of Veterinary Science.
Roseanne Cornell from Souls, plant scientist.
Pauline Ross, Associate Dean Education.
Elisa Bone, I work with Pauline on some of the strategic curriculum.
Okay. And that's Mikey over there, he's from the ACCC. And we have decided to record this because we're developing a repository of but just let us know so he doesn't do any crowd scenes or anything. And I'm Gabrielle from the National Centre for Cultural Competence, and I'd also like to start by acknowledging that we are meeting on Aboriginal land, always was and always will be. And we always like to recognise that this is as much as it's a place of learning now, it has always been a place of learning in different ways without the buildings and so on. And we recognise the elders, past, present and future. So what I'm, in my 20 minutes, which starts now, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what cultural competence is. And we're in the process of developing a sort of a curriculum framework. As Jaime said earlier, we're all learning in this space, and for us, we might have some knowledge around cultural competence, but we don't have the knowledge around specific discipline cultural competence. And so what we're trying to develop is some basic understanding of what we think cultural competence in the curriculum should include, and then hopefully work with different people across the university in how it will actually look within different discipline spaces. So getting right to the chase, there is no one definition of cultural competence. There's many. This first one is kind of the one that everybody uses, and if you look at different definitions since the 80s, this came out of the US from a team of people that were working in health, and cultural competence is primarily grown out of the health space. Other spaces use different terminology, but they were looking at cultural competence from the perspective of trying to work out why health outcomes for disadvantaged and minoritized groups were so appalling. And they found that it was a lack of cultural competence, a lack of understanding about diversity and different cultures in the health system. And so that's kind of thing, and I think the really important part of this is this congruency between the behaviours, attitudes and policies. You know, there's no point having brilliant policies but people don't know how to be culturally competent in the workplace, or having really great people who are really culturally competent but nothing to support them through policies and strategies. And we're lucky here that we do have a strategy in the university strategy and the education strategy, and as John will talk about, it's now graduate quality, so that really helps us bring it all together. For us at the National Centre, there's a bit missing from that, or it's not really explicit, and that's why we also use the second definition, because it's really about understanding yourself as a cultural being. You know, we don't start with understanding other people, we start with understanding who we are, because often for many of us, particularly those who identify with dominant cultures, we find it really hard to actually identify what our culture is. It's like everybody else has a culture, but we don't. And that can be quite challenging for people. And so for us, a lot of our work is around self-reflection and understanding how we were socialised, how we see the world, where that's all come from, how we became the people that we are, and then how that impacts on other people and the ways that we work together. So they're kind of our framework, and I don't really have time to go, ooh, someone just blew me. That was a bit weird. Anyway, so that's kind of a very brief overview of it. And in the NCCC, of course, we sit under the DVC Indigenous Strategy and Services, and so we're very much focused on cultural competence, understanding it primarily from Indigenous perspectives and weaving in Indigenous understandings and ways of knowing and being and doing. And that's because we kind of, we see cultural competence as we can't get it right in how we interact with our First Peoples, then we're not going to get it right for anybody. And so we often refer to Aboriginal context, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander context, but of course it adapts, cultural competence adapts across all different diversity contexts. And so we're trying to help people to develop the skills so whatever context that they are in, they're able to work effectively and ethically in that space. And for us at the NCCC, cultural competence, you know, a lot of people hate the word competence. A lot of people want it's just to tick a box, it's just something we've got to do, and you know, I totally get that. But for us, it's very much a social justice and human rights issue. You know, people die quite regularly in Australia from a lack of cultural competence in health and prison justice systems and so on. So it's not just a warm and fuzzy thing for us. It very much is about creating change, transforming the spaces that we live and work in so that people work better together and people receive the kind of care and services that they should expect as human beings, and not because, you know, not to be judged or stereotyped because they're particular groups. And so for us, it's a really important aspect that underpins the work that we do. I said that already. So what I'm going to do is we've developed a whole range of resources over the 3 or 4 years that we've been in existence, and I'll talk about them in a minute. But what we've done there, and some of them, they weren't really designed for embedding in the curriculum as such. They were designed to help staff across the university, not just academic but professional staff, and every function of the university to understand cultural competence and then to work out how it can work in their particular context. But what we're doing at the moment is kind of going, well, these are the fundamental concepts that we think are essential when we're talking about embedding in the curriculum. And so these are some of the themes, and this is still in development, so it's not kind of a finite, a finished document. And then we've kind of aligned some of the resources that we have with them. So I'll just go through them relatively quickly. So of course, first up, we have to understand what cultural competence is, and that's not as easy as it sounds, in the sense of some people talk a lot about cultural competence, but they're really talking about cultural awareness. They're really talking about learning about other cultures. But for us, again, it's very much about understanding cultural competence as its own theory and its own definition. For us, it's very important to understand it as a social justice and decolonising imperative, that we're not just here, as I said before, to tick a box or to, I guess, shy away from having some hard conversations, because this work is quite difficult. You know, you can get into some really challenging spaces around the way that people think and how that impacts on people from different cultures and diversity, and we talk about knowledges in a minute. And for us, it's important to also understand the Indigenous context of cultural competence. And then, of course, every discipline and every organisational unit in the university also has their own, needs to understand cultural competence, how it fits within their own discipline area, which is what we'll be talking about later today. And we have some, I won't talk about the resources now, I'll talk about them in a minute. So then the next part of that is understanding self. Like I said, for us it's really important that we understand ourselves as cultural beings. We need to understand what culture is, so some cultural theory. We really need to understand our identities, assumptions, worldviews, stereotypes, biases, where our values come from, our beliefs come from, and also institutional cultures. Of course, I'm sure it's not news to any of you that every institution has a culture, every discipline has a culture, and so we need to unpack some of that as well. We also add in social and emotional wellbeing, which is a bit unusual for the cultural competence space, really, but it's really, and this came very much from Juanita Sherwood, who is our director. She's been acting DVC, but she's coming back in a couple of weeks to be our director. And from her perspective, as an Aboriginal person, understanding the social emotional well-being models of other cultural groups, but particularly of ourselves, and how we work in a space, how we build our resilience, how we build our understanding of other people's resilience, and importantly triggers, understanding the triggers, because as I said before, this can be quite a difficult space to work in. And if you're talking about racism and identity and worldview, people are going to have to really think through a few things, and particularly those from dominant cultures. And so we try and embed mindfulness, resilience work, all those kind of things to help build people's capacity to work in this space and to work through things appropriately. And we have a half-day workshop specifically on that. It's also really important that we address things like racism, whiteness and privilege. Again, we're not here for the warm and fuzzies. If we're going to really decolonise and unpack and change, we have to understand our institutional issues around racism and privilege, and within ourselves as well. And so we have workshops and an e-module on racism, anti-racism. We don't actually train people to be racist, but also recognising what racism is and how do you deal with it. And that's one of the biggest questions we get asked in this work is, how do you have these conversations with people to address racism? And there's the really obvious forms of racism, but there's so much embedded and inherent that dominant cultures can't see because they don't experience it. So we're really trying to unpack that and how things intersect as well. And then diverse knowledge is because, you know, often we're the bastions of one way of thinking, Western knowledge is. It's a bit of a debatable thing at the moment, isn't it? But also, you know, and so from the Indigenous perspective as well, how do you bring in different ways of knowing, being and doing, and how do you broaden it out to include other diverse cultures? And then that leads into how do we engage ethically with each other, what is good engagement with different groups, and then again back to our discipline-specific knowledges and cultures. And we also talk a lot about relational learning, so we think that to do good cultural competence is a different way of teaching and learning, and which we call relational learning, and so it's much more about developing the relationship between student and teacher and different ways of doing things. And then of course contextual knowledge. So for us at the NCCC, that's a lot about understanding our Indigenous histories and present situation and political context. But it applies to all, whatever context you're in, you need to understand the context that you're working in. And again, back to discipline context. So for us, we focused a lot on what does it mean for a university to be living and working and developing study on Aboriginal land. What can we learn from Redfern, which was really such a hotbed of political activism in the 70s and 80s, and what does it mean to us now, and what do we mean by self-determination? And we have a MOOC around that, and also one of our modules is very specifically developed with the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council to talk about the importance of understanding our space, our place in this Aboriginal land. And then underlying all of that, this is just skills and capabilities that are embedded throughout all of our work. Critical self-reflection is the most important one, that ability to really reflect on yourself and your political social context. And that can be, again, quite hard, and even just finding the space for that. We run a leadership program, which hopefully some of you will be interested in next year, and we take people away for 3 days. And a good part of it is just taking time out to think through some of these issues, particularly around understanding yourself and your wellbeing and your own identities. Active listening, that's another skill that we embed throughout our workshops and so on. Cross-cultural communication, how do we have these difficult conversations? How do we create safe spaces, as much as we can create safe spaces, to have conversations that can be very difficult and really address some of the issues? You know, I'm rushing through this, right? It's cultural competence on speed, or something. So these are what we've developed that can help you, hopefully. We have online modules which we're trying to encourage all staff across the university to do. They've been going for a couple of years now. There's 5 of them. It can vary how long they take, anything from about 40 minutes to, if you really get into it, an hour or 2. They're very self-reflective. There's prompts all the way through to get you to think about different things. And they're kind of like our introduction to cultural competence. And we encourage everybody to do these because then it kind of gives a baseline of what cultural competence is for people to work from. And this year we just started running them for students as a 2 credit point OLE. And we had pretty good uptake of that in semester 1 when we ran it. And we'll run them again next year. So you can, as staff, you can do them through Career Path, and one of the things that we're really trying to get different groups to do is encourage all their staff to do these things. Some people are now embedding them in AP&Ds and so on, but also for students. And we can make the modules available, if you want to use the modules in your courses, we can make them available to you for you to incorporate through your programs. Just come and talk to me about that. We also have face-to-face workshops for staff. We do work with students, but primarily we work with staff for these workshops. And there again, you can see that they just cover off on all the things that I've already mentioned. And we can also do bespoke ones. So, you know, if you've got a 2-hour meeting that you want us to come and do something just to introduce people to cultural competence, we could do those kind of things, or a full day, or whatever it is, just let us know. We're available. And we're just, this Connecting Cultural Competence to Curriculum modules have been available actually for about 3 years now, maybe 2, on Blackboard. And together with John and his team, we're now converting them over to Canvas, and we'll review them and we'll build on them to create more of a repository around resources, particularly for cultural competence in the curriculum. So more directed for academics who are having to embed this in curriculum. So stay tuned for that, but it will become available soon, very soon. We also have this Aboriginal Sydney MOOC, which I have postcards over here for, which Mikey and I developed, and this is a kind of a slightly different take on it, but it's an open access course, as you know. Anybody can do it for free, and it's looking at Sydney the city, not the university, through Aboriginal perspectives, all different ways of looking at Sydney, and it's really trying to make visible the invisible, because often people say, oh, there's no Aboriginal people in Sydney, or it's all ancient stuff. But we're trying to show that it's very much present, and there's a whole range of people, from artists to community members to activists to art curators, Metro Land Council, Sydney Council, all looking at how they experience Sydney from their perspective, all Aboriginal people. And it's a really great way. A lot of people are using it for international students coming in, and a lot of organisations are using it as well for their staff external to the university to try and engage people in the cultural competence journey and different ways of knowing, being and doing through that. So highly recommend that. And of course I would, because it's my course, but other people told me it's really good as well, so it's a personal view. And so that's really a very, very quick snapshot of how we see cultural competence and the key elements. Of course, if you need more information or you want to come and talk to us, we're available. That's my email, and we have a website on the university website, the normal, the website as well. So, any questions? I'll read now. Good.
I would like to add something that is that now we have created a network. We have created a group where all people who are interested in cultural competence across the university can come together, and we discuss these case studies, how we are embedding, what resources are available, and the NCCC is leading that group.
I forgot about that. And the reason I forgot about it is because we're going to do a similar workshop for other people around the university, but you've been to this one, so you probably won't come. But if you're interested in joining the network, and it really is to share and sort of cross-fertilise ideas about how to do this embedding work, just let me know and I'll add you to the invite list. We don't have a meeting scheduled at the moment, but we will before the end of the year, so yeah, I'll come in. Good. Any other questions? I'll hand over to John.